Joining us now is Richard Johnson, lecturer in U.S. politics at Queen Mary University of London. Richard, welcome back to CNN. It's good to see you. Now,
Good morning.
Donald Trump, he is on a drive to slash the federal workforce. At CPAC, we saw that video of him celebrating the mass firings. Earlier, Elon Musk wielded that very symbolic chainsaw. But we know that top unions are pushing back. So what's going to happen next? Will Trump and Doge get their way or not?
Well, it seems that Elon Musk is trying to do what he did when he took over Twitter, which was to embark on mass firings as a way of streamlining the organization, although then in some cases that turned out to be a false economy because there were all kinds of problems that then emerged with Twitter. But the US federal government is not Twitter. Elon Musk is not the CEO of the US federal government. And the email of personal management over the weekend does not, as far as I can see, carry the force of a CEO's instruction to a company. So the people who ultimately would be in charge of these questions about people being fired cannot be Elon Musk. They have to be the heads of the different agencies. And so the real test will be are the people that Donald Trump has installed to lead these agencies sufficiently independent of mind to push back or to ignore what Elon Musk is saying, or will they be supplicants to Elon Musk?
That remains to be seen. Meanwhile, more firings at the very top of the Pentagon. Trump has fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He has pushed out 5 other admirals and generals. How unusual is this, and what kind of impact could it have on the U.S. military?
It's, of course, very dramatic. It's not without precedent. Probably the most dramatic example of a president pushing out a senior military commander was when Harry Truman removed Douglas MacArthur from the command over the Korean War in 1951. That was a move that was politically risky for Truman because MacArthur was actually very popular in the United States, and some thought MacArthur might even run for president the following year. But Truman took that decision because MacArthur was clearly defying in the statements that Truman had made about the scope of the Korean War. And basically MacArthur was keen to draw China much more into the conflict, which Truman didn't want to do. This is not the situation with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This seems to be, from what I can read of it, it's something almost of a personal vendetta that Pete Hegseth has had about certain Biden appointees who are racial minority or women. And Hegseth has claimed without evidence that they were put in that position because they had that characteristic. And that seems to me much of the basis of this removal.
And what appears to be personal vendettas, these mass federal firings, appear to be weighing on Donald Trump's poll numbers, as CNN's Harry Enton was reporting just a beat ago. You know, we're only just a month into his presidency 2.0, but it appears that Americans are negatively taking in Trump and his expressions of presidential authority. What's your read on the polling?
Well, there's always a sort of cost of governing effect. And so it's not unusual that when people are elected, they start on a high and then they atrophy in their support. Of course, these days, presidents don't start at quite as high a level of support as they used to. Presidents used to come in and they might get 5% approval begin their term. These days, they're lucky to get above 50%. Of course, Donald Trump didn't quite win 50% of the popular vote in the presidential election. So there were more Americans voting against him in the presidential election than voting for him. So I'm not terribly surprised that he's already what we'd say underwater with respect to his approval ratings. I think the question will be, if he dips below, if he's in the 40s range, that's sort of okay for him. If he dips below 40%, that then can be very troubling, particularly from the perspective of the Republicans about dare I mention them, the midterm elections.
Stating the obvious here, it's still very early days in the Trump 2.0 presidency, even though it has felt far longer than just over a month. Richard Johnson, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your insight. Take care.
Thank you.